Thank you. Thank you, thank you. So we're going to talk about rigor today. And this talk is a result of my curiosity. Last DDDU, I went to Eric Evans' masterclass, and which was a lot of fun doing modeling on something we knew nothing about, and then reflecting on it. And one of the topics that we just only briefly touched on was, when does your model need to be rigorous and when should it not be? And how to experiment about that. And I felt that there was a lot more to explore afterwards, because I'm a heuristic hunter-collector type person. So I contacted Eric, and we had several wonderful Zoom conversations about rigor, and what we thought it was and what we thought it wasn't, and how to express it, and some examples and story sharing. And that inspired me to further explore this on my own. So full disclosure about this talk is that the conclusions and many of the stories are my own, and I take full rigorous responsibility for anything I might say. So let's get started. Okay. I want to make it clear that there are two aspects to rigor. There's a distinction between how you go about modeling, so there's potentially rigor in the process you do of modeling, and the second one is how you go about representing necessary rigor in your systems that you're trying to build. I'm going to spend most of my time on the second aspect and sort of end up with the modeling process rigor at the end. But first, doesn't it make sense that we define rigor? As you can see, right, you look at this and you go, what is rigor? There are 6 definitions in the American Heritage Dictionary, ranging from strictness, severity, to rigor mortis, actually. and there's a lot of different nuances in those, but really what I'm going to focus on as the most appropriate way to think about modeling and model process rigor is this definition. Strictness in adhering to a standards or a method, which is the process part, or exactitude. Okay. So that's just so that you're clear. There are 2 ways to think about rigor in your code and your software system. Adherence to standards. So if I'm building systems where I need to ensure that we're precisely following a process or a method, or supporting people as they do so, that's adherence to some kind of standard way of doing things. When I think about exactitude, what does that mean? I'm determining some kind of precise, accurate, I won't say truthful, you'll see, to a well-formed question before proceeding. We have to have some rigor in this answer before we can go on. So, let's talk about adherence to a standard process. And in this case, I'm going to give you a case study so that this is the rigor should make you stay awake at night because it's really hard. You're supporting people as they precisely follow some kind of process or method. So how many of you have heard of Alaska Airlines Flight 1282? Not very many, but this is the airliner where the door blew out. So you've heard that. It blew out 10 kilometers from my home, right? And fortunately, and it was January 5th, I remember the day very well, and because I fly Alaska Airlines, right? And this is a MAX 737 that, as it was taking off from the Portland International Airport, which is where I flew from here to Amsterdam, the door blew out. of this little door, and you go, where's the door? Okay, so there it is. That's actually a photo of it. And as you can see, that there's this thing that was a door, but it really wasn't a door. It was plugged, and it failed. The plug failed. It popped off, and like 3 days later, they found it in the Portland Hills. So how could this have happened, right? Oh, by the way, as you notice, there's a seat there. When they plugged the door, they put an extra row of seats. Turns out that there were like 6 people injured in that. It was only at 3,000 meters that this fell out. If it had been another 5,000 or 10,000 meters, a lot of people would have died. But anyway, the net outcome of it was that one teenager lost his shirt because he was sitting in that row. And fortunately, only 6 people were moderately injured. They're all now suing Boeing for the aircraft. But so how did this happen? Aren't airplanes supposed to be built and checked and all those safety things that we do? Well, so here's just to get some more drama here before we get in there. There's a version of it with a door in there. You can see on the left-hand side. And a plug door is on the right-hand side. So you can still see that there's kind of an outline of a door, but it's sort of made so it shouldn't come out, right? And they put in an extra window there, and they put in an extra row of seats. Okay, so here's a view of the Boeing factory in Renton, Washington, where the MAX 737 was assembled. And as you can see, it's like a 6-lane superhighway, right? They're just moving airplanes through. There are thousands of people working on it, but there is a rigorous process for quality inspection. There's lots of sensor-based smart software that's running there, telling what's going on. There's, at the moment, tracking of what's going on. There's a system where you have to go through a rigorous safety and process step. The mechanics on the shop floor have to enter in things that have been correctly done. And that process is defined by the Federal Aviation Agency. So the FAA has to approve your process for manufacturing. And your software has to support it. There's also, besides, it's high-tech place there, lots of software. They even have software for tightening wrenches, right, to the right precision. You think, oh, okay. But there's a lot of stuff moving through there. There's also, besides this rigorous process that you have to follow and record and quality checks and inspections, there's also I would call it Boeing Slack system that allows people to, in a side channel, communicate when things are going wrong or need to be fixed or shift crew changes or whatever. So they have a big Slack that's supporting, getting things really done outside of this, to support this rigorous process. So what happened? Turns out that this manufacturing process had prioritized, and it had done for a number of years, speed over quality, right? And so, in fact, there's a quote, and I actually removed the slide because I didn't want to show the face of the CFO who just recently apologized. He basically said, well, for many years we've prioritized going fast over quality. Okay, so what did that do in this socio-technical system of people going fast? This is actually, people have confessed to these things. They've done audits and figured it out. It led to mechanics. So when you're doing a step in this rigorous process that you have to check up on, in some instances, that was the Boeing official quote, to sign off on their own work. Yep, did it, right? In fact, there was as much as 10% in one plant where I did it. And they installed parts on a regular basis that had not been logged or inspected. Just wasn't time for that. Had to get things out. And this other one is kind of, you think about this one, and what can we do about this? If I needed someone to sign it off and it couldn't be me, you kind of went and found a buddy, someone to inspector shopping for someone to check it without really, giving you any grief. So even if we have the most communicative software, the smartest devices, the most rigorous process. By the way, one of the things about this process software, and I got into is far more geeky about this than I'm explaining in this talk. If they found a mistake and it was a step or two back, you had to go back and repeat it and go again. You couldn't fix it right there. And so people will find ways to circumvent rigor when under pressure, right? So how can we fix that? I think this heuristic of anyone leading or being involved in architecturally, design, modeling-wise, when a high degree of process rigor is required in a system like this, we have to have human agency, the ability for people who notice problems to report them to be heard. And they should be able to take remediation actions. And so human agency to fix things or call out things. And environmental conditions under which they're working need to be primary concerns. Our software serves them, not the other way around. And we can't forget that. So what happened was that there were 2 bolts that were missing on that plug. And someone noticed it. They noticed it. But it never got fixed. Got shipped to Alaska. They inspected it. They didn't go inside and look at the bolts, but they inspected the seal and everything looked fine. So, okay. So what happens when you have systems like this and you have catastrophic failures? Fortunately, in this case, there was not life loss, but I think in other Boeing aircraft there have been. You get inspected. You get under the intense microscope. Your stock prices go down. It's really gloomy. They don't fire software engineers or mechanical engineers or process engineers, but they are laying off people at the factory because there's less manufacturing going on. So what happened, here's some recent good news, is that they added additional inspections at the factory. Yes, okay. And they no longer accept, the fuselage was provided by Spirit Airways, and they no longer accept any fuselage that has known problems in it, right? So they accepted something that could have had problems that needed to be fixed when they went through the Boeing plant. So that's good. There are impacts of this. But from the people's side, so they've changed their process, they've tightened it up a bit, but the workers asked for after this and got additional factory floor training about how do I respond correctly to problems and how can we be listened to and what kind of training should we have from both the management and supervisory levels. But what's more exciting to me is that the management is getting overhauled too. Unfortunately, when you have a culture of going fast with quality being second place, it's going to take a while to get there. So Spirit Airlines here's another improvement that happened. They're the ones who produce the fuselages for Boeing. How do they know that those door plugs are really okay? What they had was called a factory production activity. So it was like, not really well specified, that the FAA audited when they were checking out Spirit, because that was their door plug. And what they found was that mechanics were checking the seal plug stability in two ways. They were using a credit card to see whether they could wedge it around the door, and then they were like throwing something on it to see whether they could get air blow through it, and that was good enough. And when they first did it, they didn't have a good process in place. They had, material, liquids that might be caustic or not good to the airplane fuselage. So the Spirit engineers looked at this when they was pointed out in the audit and designed something. And they said, well, Dawn soap is great because, you can clean oily ducts and it won't hurt anything, so it will also not hurt the fuselage. And then Boeing has taken, this is a recent thing, has taken that and gotten the approval for this process to be okay by the FAA. So it's an ongoing thing. But if I'm coming back to socio-technical systems and the rigor it's required to be enforced, you have to be aware of false dichotomies, right? Is it really quality versus speed? If that's your mindset, then you're gonna, and you also need to remove unnecessary constraints. If a process step is, found to be defective later on, do I have to go through all the preceding ones or can I fix it here? I mean, that's something that I think, I don't know what they've figured out, but that would be really, and you need to reduce confusion around any process step that demands rigor, and particularly when life is involved. So fortunately, we don't often work in those systems, but they are out there. Anybody work in systems like this? Thank you. But even in systems that need rigor in process, you need to foster agency. People who are doing the work knows what's going on, so you got to listen to them. And then you need to observe what really happens, how people really work, adapt and adjust. Okay, so socio-technical systems where you have rigor are really hard. So I want to turn to exactitude because that's probably what we are most familiar with in our modeling of the kinds of systems we build. And the definition, once again, is determining a precise, accurate answer to a well-formed question before proceeding. Sounds simple, right? Unfortunately, exactitude isn't exactly obvious in many cases. It's not arbitrary when you're having you have to support a physical law or a mathematical calculation or a formula. If I'm computing interest or principal on a financial transaction, though, it's more complicated than just doing the math because like when did I actually receive the payment? How much was applied to principal in it? So it can get really complicated. So in other situations, how exact you need to be is something that really oftentimes people struggle with in requirements. So how many of you have gotten a requirement where it says you must do exactly, blah, 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 some kind of characteristic of a system? You get a number. And are you sure that that number is the right number? Oftentimes it's pulled out of the air or some other reason, but we don't usually know why sometimes. Okay, so when I have to have an exact answer, calculation of value, I'm advising you to make it really clear in your head what question is my software trying to get an answer to. That may seem obvious. Well, we know what we're getting an answer to, right? We're calculating this, we're doing that. But authentication and authorization, which I'm going to talk about, is authentic. Are really things that are really fuzzy around, but we spend a lot of energy on them. So authentication is established. It just means establishing genuineness. Is it true? Is it real? But there are several different synonyms for authentication that I think you should be aware of, to think about. Confirming is just removing some doubts by an authoritative statement or an indisputable fact that you can get, usually from a user or from the other system that you're communicating with. Now that's confirming. It's removing doubts. Corroborating is simply strengthening what is already partly established, so we can corroborate evidence. Substantiating is offering evidence. Verifying is establishing correspondence between facts that someone proposes and those that we know, our system knows. And validation is established by factual proof or authoritative affirmation. I thought, well, okay. So what questions are you really answering? If you think about it, what are we doing when someone enters a username and a password? We are just confirming that a known user in the system is known in the system of record by the name and password that's provided to us. We're not saying anything about the person who actually did that. We all know that, but that's really what's going on. When I have to answer a secret question, what are we trying to do there? We're corroborating that the secret question I provided to the system, I remembered it, for one thing. And I didn't put it on a piece of paper that someone else, you're hoping that that's the case. And we're substantiating that someone is not a bot by having them identify a capture, right, correctly. I hate captures, by the way. Just like, oh. Then there's the question, I'm not a bot, right? You tick off the box. It's like, okay, annoying. They're all annoying, okay. But just to be aware, when you're doing this, what question? I'm trying to confirm, I'm trying to be rigorous about what am I actually doing. So let's talk about another kind of thing that is annoying, is about identity. Sorry about that. If your system has to be really rigorous, and Intel is right up the highway from where I live, where they do this, you will spend a lot of effort going into building a system. But even then, so it's a facial recognition system designed for people entering buildings or going on airlines or whatever these days. Even then, when you look at this, they talk about easy enrollment, fast authentication, so trusted and secure. Now look at the failure rates. 1 in a million false acceptance. Is that rigorous enough? Probably. The false true acceptance rate is kind of not so good. What about those 0.23 people that it can never recognize? 2-3%. So that's an example of where I know I'm building a rigorous thing. I have to do it. Most of the time, the software we do, and this is a story that Eric shared with me. The CDIC insures banks when they go bust. And so if I have an account in a bank and this, I got this from the CDIC website. They were saying it guarantees that up to 100,000 Canadian dollars for me and another, or my tax, all these different kinds of accounts that I can have, that it will pay me back because it's insured by the government. So Eric spent time modeling with folks at the CDIC to see whether they could be rigorous about identifying someone who makes a claim, right? Or who had an account. And it turns out that the software in many banks, when you enter an account, you're supposed to enter your Canadian identification number as well, right? Sounds reasonable. You should have one. You shouldn't have an account without that. That's kind of a legal requirement. But what happened, and this is a problem that they were trying to fix with being more rigorous with their modeling, was when you had a newborn and it didn't yet have an account, a Canadian ID, parents or whatever were still opening up accounts for that, and so the bank agent would enter in the parent's ID. Is that a problem? Turns out if they have exactly the same names, right? John Smith, my little baby John, they would be identified as the same person. Okay. Now, they spent a lot of time trying to weed out, could they spot these things and not, count up the money that would be refunded to them or not. They spent some time and they said, you know what? What we figure out is so difficult to explain to people about why we might be rejecting their claim or only giving them so much money, that instead, we'll just let those, if I only give you back 100,000 and you really had 50,000 that your son now had, they'll come and ask us for the money, right? So, so they decided after all this modeling rigor, I can fix things. Are the addresses have been correlated? And they said, no, too complicated to explain to people who are making claims, so we'll just let them tell us, because it's their money that they're trying to get back, not ours. Which is another lesson about this, is if you demand that things be there and they aren't there in the real world, people will find ways to circumvent enforced rigor that gets in their way. So one might say, oh, those bank agents, right, they shouldn't have entered in the number, but they had to create an account. Now, one might say, what are the implications if they didn't enter in an ID? But that gets into a lot of discussions. Or what's the real requirement here? So a heuristic to think about is relax the model rigor when any increased complexity outweighs the benefit. And this, I like this. If you look at this very carefully, it's trying to determine the age of an undated world map by answering all these questions. Now, I think that's absolutely critical that we give the right answer to that, but you may not. So what about authority? Which is, do I have the appropriate permissions to do something? Okay, so this is a website for a winery very near my home. And people under the age of 21 in my state are not allowed to drink, right? So you go to the website, which has a visiting hours, and you can join a wine club and whatever. And this is on the home page. It says, welcome. Are you 21 years or older? Yes or no? Has anybody seen sites like that? It's like, oh, okay. All right. What would you do?
One big green button.
One big green button, right? It's like, okay. Now it turns out that, and I did some exploration into how many wineries do this and how many don't. It turns like those in the Willamette Valley, which is more highly populated where I live, tend to have these on their sites. Those that are further east, where people are more conservative, do not have that. Now, there's no requirement. There is no absolute requirement that you check the age of anyone before they go to a winery website. There is no requirement. Now, why do people do this? They got social pressure to do that, and they added this. So what you're doing there is rigor theater, right? Now, you're doing it to satisfy some grumpy people that didn't like that you were providing something that children shouldn't see or do. If you're doing rigor theater, you should know that that's what you're doing. And I actually think it's pretty appalling to do that. But think about, do you ever perform rigor theater just because? There are potentially more rigorous age verification systems that you could do if you needed to. And this is actually becoming, the first one is becoming more common, is that you have to give some kind of government ID or something to some certification agency, and they say, oh, you're good. And then as your software needs to, somebody tries to log in and do something, it goes to that third party to say that it's okay. But actually what's more scary is when you actually try to estimate a user's age. And you think, oh, people really aren't doing this in their software? Yes, they are. In fact, Facebook is a great example, and I won't go into gory details, but I think I might go to my notes to talk about it because I want to get the percentage. They use an external system that does facial recognition and age determination called Yoti. And it claims that it can, and it's also on Instagram as well, that it can estimate the age of people 13 to 17 years old as being under 25 with 99.93% accuracy. And that kids are 6 to 11 years old and as being under 13 with only 98.35% accuracy. So beware, your parental controls aren't gonna, anyway, this stuff really bothers me. So I'm sure there's social pressures to determine this, and there's increasingly, we're gonna do this, but my personal heuristic is don't gratuitously enforce rigor when it is impossible to determine the truth or get definitive answers, if you can get away with it, right? Sometimes you have to put some degree of rigor theater around what you're doing. So, on the other hand, you need to increase model complexity sometimes to get the necessary rigor. Now, here's an example. I worked with a client, Freddie Mac, and an analyst spent a lot of time trying to figure out and make sure that when someone logged onto any one of their systems or their secondary vendor systems or whatever, had the appropriate authority and accountability to do that, and they needed to audit log it because there could be fraud. It was a secondary mortgage market, and there was a lot of, are you allowed to do this, and for how long, and can you do this? So this is a very simple model that Martin Fowler had in his analysis patterns book. And I remember going there and talking to the analyst that was working on this model, and he says, this does not cut it for us. We have much more complexity. And I said, okay, what are the implications of that? That was way too simple. So any pattern that you read may not be rigorous enough for the complexity of the rigor that your system needs to have. Right? It's only a sketch, okay? So if you need to add complexity, and they had very good business reasons for doing that, that's what you need to do. Okay. So how can we achieve the requisite rigor, and requisite means the required rigor right? And you can read this, but yeah. What are you suggesting is illegal? What happens if we do it anyway? We get fined. So it's legal, but for a fee. Okay. I'm not suggesting doing things like that, but how do we achieve requisite rigor? The real good question to think about. You may be required to enforce that, like legal laws or whatever. There's new GDPR, whatever, things coming out. There's always this kind of stuff about trust and whatever. When you're required, there might be legislation or whatever, take reasoned measures, right? Be prepared to defend your actions. Like Freddie Mac had to defend their actions for how they actually split profits amongst the secondary derivative things that they sold, because they got in trouble for being too loosey-goosey about it. So they had to actually do some modeling to do that. Defend your actions. And I'm going to say, if you can, avoid difficult to enforce situations. So like, there are sites now that if there's some laws that are very impossible to enforce in Texas, but they're trying to prohibit people from accessing certain adult sites. And the companies that are fighting that, because the fines are like $100,000 a day if you've ever caught with a child going to your site, what they do is they block the IPs coming from Texas. All right, that's an easy way. You just okay. Know the risks of non-compliance, but then also consider the ethics and values in your social responsibility. So that's my advice there. It's not really clear-cut. But then you need to define where a certain degree of rigor is required and how much you're willing to spend for that. And there's options. There's always options for introducing rigor. So, but then another thing to do is to think about constraining it to really where it's required and achievable, and don't just spread it out, because if we're doing it here, we must do it there, is not necessarily a good justification for anything in modeling. So here's an example. Eric said, well, you should carve out tiny bounded contexts where you impose rigor that you clearly and separate from other isolated contexts. So he's actually a fiddler of creating tiny little bounded contexts where here's the physics that are observed inside of this thing. So I'm giving an example, verifying that this is a phone number that's a valid phone number if you're in an international corporation is actually an interesting challenge, if you will. So instead of having one bounded context, because phone things might change over time, have one for each one that you actually are rigorously enforcing once you recognize that it's a German phone number. US people and Canadians never enter the one before because we don't think anyone else besides ourselves should have a prefix. But anyway, so the rules and how you verify things should be little tiny contexts, and rather than lump them all together. Otherwise, you just have things intertwinkled, and they really are different bounded contexts, different meaning for valid phone numbers. So here's another kind of problem that's caused through rigorous, I will say, mischief, if you will. Scott Myers lives in the Portland area, invented this term called the keyhole problem. And once you think about it, you'll now see it everywhere in systems that you use or build. And his definition for it is that every time software actually restricts something that you want to see, like looking into a system, or that you want to tell the system about, but you can't. These are natural domain things, but you can't get them in and get them out. And the restricted domain keyhole is one where some elements of the natural input domain are excluded, like forbidden characters. All right, so I'm going to tell you a story because I encounter the keyhole problem every time I use almost any system. So here's my name, right? It has the dreaded hyphen. Okay, so oftentimes I cannot enter my name into systems. You want to use my credit card? I have to put my name in, but you don't accept the hyphen. My credit card company knows about the hyphen. But the system that I'm trying to use to tell them to use doesn't accept my hyphen. So what do? I maybe squish it together, Wirfs-Brock, or Wirfs-Brock, you know. If I'm lazy, I'd probably do that, or maybe even that. Okay, and then I have to like try that until one of them works. I'm not sure that I always do them in the same order, right? And then I end up getting email or physical mail sometimes that is addressed to Brock R. Wirfs. You know, the hyphen obviously was a delimiter somewhere that system really knew about. Or anyway, it's frustrating because when I'm trying to enter my name, I want to enter my name, damn it, right? So if you want to verify that I'm rigorously entering in a name, and there's really, I mean, the hyphen has been a character in the character set since before I was born, right? So it really does exist. But anyway, the problem is I have to remember how I got wedged something in through that keyhole. And then what happens is it may even transform what I did into something else because it thinks, they'll just enter it and then we'll transform it. And that happens too. That's how the Brock R. Wirfs got there. But the fact is, systems interact with other systems. And you may have your bounded context for rigor of names, but then you interface to other systems who have their own rules for names. I don't know if anyone has a name that's in the keyhole problem, but you can probably just like, it's a constant frustration. And Delta Airlines, let's see, credit card, authorization, all kinds of things. It's like, man, I should have just made the name this and I would have been so much better, but I didn't know that. All right, so that is rigor that is restricting what is part of the natural domain for some reason. Maybe there was a reason. I don't know. I don't think so. And I tend to think that sometimes we think we have to check everything, right? Right, we have to check everything. And so my advice to you is avoid that gratuitous rigor. I mean, really question, do we need to do this? Now, is it okay if someone misspells their name? Probably. But then consistently apply it, right? The thing that's most annoying is when I have a system where I can shove something in and then the rigor is different on another part of the system. So I can't do it here. So I can't enter my name here in a customer complaint, but I can enter. Anyway, I've had this, consistently try to apply it. Even so, right, when I do this, there's going to be gotchas. So if I add degrees of rigor to my model, I can have a model that's only based on happy path scenarios. Oh, people enter in names, they're okay. Now here's another degree that includes known edge cases. I mean, seriously, if you really want a model based on requisite rigor as opposed to just things we might have made up or someone told us, that considers people, cost, benefit, risks, and certainty, right? All those factors go into what you decide is how much rigor you want there. Now, you may guess wrong, but then so what? Change it. If you were too tight, relax it. But even so, there are modeling gotchas. Requirements for rigor shift over time. Damn it. Can't they just make up their minds? Regulations change. Yeah, that's the reality. There's different assumptions that people make about rigor between bounded contexts. You know, we're all one big team, but bounded contexts often have differences of rigor. And you say, oh, we agree upon a contract between you. We'll pass you this bit of information. But do we actually go to the details of saying, what is that information? You know, the rigor about that. There's different assumptions about rigor amongst various users of systems, and that causes problems too. And then, you know, we all know domain experts always agree with each other, right? So, but they have different opinions, so it's really an opinion. So, at the end of the talk, I said I was going to talk about modeling process rigor. So far, I've talked about rigor of answering questions. And I used as an example authority on authentication, and then information quality, because that's a lot of stuff that we do. But let's talk briefly about rigor in a modeling process that you may have. So the first level is, well, just create a model. Let's go. You might talk with domain experts and then create a model. You might talk with domain experts, create a model, review it with them. You might collaborate, do collaborative design and implementation, exploring options, pointing out where rigor may or may not. Ask the question about rigor. How rigorous does this have to be? And I think those are all, depending upon the situation of your system, that you have to make those judgment calls. More rigor is not necessarily better, but sometimes it is. So I'm getting to the end of the talk. But there is light at the end of the tunnel, I promise. There's no rigorous definition of rigor. This is an American mathematician, and I'm going, well, I majored in computer science, not math. I knew that. But, so what do I do? All right, okay, what am I going to do? What do I do as a modeler, right? What am I going to do? Someone who really cares about the business. So I looked for inspiration, and I found, I wanted to say definitions or degrees of rigor, and I did a Google search, and I happened to find this paper that was written by this guy, Lauren Hofseth. It's hard to say his name. And it was in Carcinogenesis, right? It's a journal about cancer. Okay, and it's a recent article, and he defined 6 levels of rigor in scientific methods. And I thought that was interesting, where insidious rigor was like you were spoofing it on purpose, okay? All the way to enduring rigor, that they're independently repeatable. This is like, I think, Hillel's talk yesterday inspired me to think about this even more. And there was this rigor level 4. Level 4 might be good enough, right? Where they randomly apply rigor only when necessary and if asked, right? So even scientists have this problem. But I, being a software geek, you notice that insidious rigor is really not rigor at all, and it starts at 6 and goes down to 1 being the top. Well, I propose these categories for software modeling rigor, and I start at L0 because I'm a geek, right? Software geek. Okay. So ad hoc rigor, I want to be really clear about this, is that I casually apply it, only when asked to, and the outcome is really meh. And it might be rigor theater, and that might be what you need to do sometimes. But if you're just doing it to be theatrical, don't. Selective rigor is where experience dictates it. And that's not bad. If you know that rigor should be here because financial transactions about this particular aspect, we have to do this kind of precision, we have to get answers that are more definitive, loan agreements have to have this profile of, anyway, it's a good chance of effectiveness. Careful rigor takes an extra step where I apply rigor. I represent in the code, test and monitor my system behaviors to see whether it's really doing what it's doing, and I think process rigor is a good place for this, and it has a higher chance of effectiveness. An even more rigorous rigor, I can come up with a better name, so I thought an awkward name, one of the things that Eric talks about, if you don't have a good name for it, give it an awkward name, where it's applied across the board, and that you develop scenarios for known cases, edge cases, risk-based. Now, I'm not saying that level 3 is what we all need to strive for. If we're building space shuttles or things with life are in the process, we might want to think about that and really try to that's really how we should be working on our modeling and our process for modeling. So I'm not really implying that rigor level 3 is better than level 1. Level 0 is, yeah. But so that's another thing to think about, is like what level of rigor, given the systems that you're building, is really required. So rather than staying up at night worrying about these things, I'm going to end with saying thank you. There is light at the end of the tunnel if you think carefully about the level of rigor that may be required and do the right things. So thank you.